We have an amazing group of journalists here, and I couldn't pass on giving you the opportunity to ask questions. So who wants to be the first?
Who'd like to be the second?
Okay.
The current administration, do you think they just really believe deregulation is going to be great for our country, or are they just like horrible people, or why do we read about the current EPA just trying to dismantle everything that you do?
I don't think they're horrible people. I mean, I didn't know Scott Pruitt, but I knew Andrew Reala. He's not a horrible person. I just think this administration, more than any other, is managed out of the White House with very little discussion and just direction. So I think it all stems from who's sitting in the White House. I think that the choice that you have to make as a person who has been in government a long time is, even if you're a nice person, you got to make a decision as to whether or not you can continue to be a nice person and work in different positions for different people. And this kind of stuff sucks you in, right? It just sucks you in, and you think you're going to be able to get there, and you're going to be able to do good things, and then maybe you realize you can't. And I think some of that might happen.
Yes.
Sort of following on that, administrations have been swinging back and forth from one party to the other, and that changes the EPA's leadership. Down deep in what it's actually doing, in its regulations, in its rulemaking, in its deep, wonky policy territory.
Yep.
How much has the ship really changed, and where would you advise us to look for things that are going to be long-term, deep in the rulebook changes that we should be paying attention to?
That's a really, really good question. The things you probably hear about are the least problematic of what's happening in the agency. It's the buried stuff. They're making changes in how science is done. They're making changes in policy decisions that they're not advertising, but they're just looking at it differently, and they'll get to it later. And those are changes in, they're really wonky. So in how they count things, like emissions, basically when you have a new facility that you want to get a permit for, that's a big facility that's going to emit a lot. The way that the Clean Air Act works is that if you want to have a new facility and you're in an area where there's bad air quality anyways, you got to offset that when you want to build it, and you got to calculate what your emissions are. And they basically have told every state that, and they've told the EPA that they're going to take whatever numbers the folks looking for a permit provide. They're not allowed to question it. That in and of itself is, what the hell are you talking about? You don't question it. They don't need to provide you the arithmetic, never mind sort of the math, And so they're doing all these little things that when you're in the system, you realize they unravel the thread of how you do things. They've almost totally stopped enforcement and compliance efforts. They just don't want to do enforcement. And if you're caught, your penalty is much less than probably the profit you made for causing the problem. And so it's those things that people like me go, oh my God, can you believe that? And they're sending the signals to states, and there's a lot of states you have to understand that have dismantled their individual ability to do this work, because states were so much harder hit so much more quickly with the downturn in the economy. And so they've relied on EPA to pick up the slack for them. And now that EPA isn't picking up the slack, there's really big challenges going on with the way in which the agency is doing its business, not writing its rules. And those are the things I worry about the most, the dismantling of the science advisory boards and the way in which they're looking at what science is acceptable or isn't. Those will take a long time for that history to go away. And there'll be a lot of, facilities permitted that are going to be causing problems for local communities, and we will not be able to undo that very quickly.
Go ahead. Yes. You. Yes.
So just following on to Rob's question, so how do we as reporters get into some of that buried stuff and are able to, what tips would you have for us to, go beyond the rules and report on it?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly can hook you up with people who can talk about that. There is an environmental law program at Harvard where one of the person who used to be my senior counsel and when I was the assistant administrator for AIR, he's got a lot of this on the web. So there's an ability to access where the policy changes are. And so I'm more than happy to help you find sources for this stuff. It exists, it's just wonky. And people look at it and go, ooh, their eyes daze over. Mine too. But I know that in reality, those are the kinds of things that are most damaging. It was a really good first question, because you're really right. The stuff that we're paying attention to is not really the meat. It's the motion.
Yes.
You sort of touched on this earlier, but can you tell us your thoughts on the EPA's new proposal on its secret science?
Oh, God, help us. My thoughts are not good. My mother would tell me when you can't say anything good, you have to shut up, so I probably ought to be quiet. But I never, ever paid attention to my mother, so I'll speak. It's really dangerous. It's really dangerous. Its sole purpose is to dismantle some of the best science we have available to us. Doing science, that science underpinning public health, is so different than doing science for medical procedures. It's just fundamentally different. We can't go around and manipulate people and see how they change. You got to do a whole lot of science to understand what the change is and what the other factors are that you need to consider that might be going on. It's very hard work to do, and they're just trying to make it harder. So they're trying to get rid of our ability to do studies that are about large populations without making transparent personal health information, and it's just not going to happen. So it's an insidious way of making it look like they're doing something good when they're not. And I'm really interested, because I shouldn't actually say this publicly because I don't want to give them any clues to the deficiencies of the earlier proposal. But they put something out that basically said that the only sound science needs to be replicable. Science needs to be replicable, yes, by scientists, not by staff of congressional committees or, people who want to manipulate the science. And so basically they said that they're going, if you can't basically make public all the raw data, then it's not replicable, which is not true. But the challenge they face is if they don't distinguish their definition of what's replicable from to EPA only, then what do you do with FDA? What do you do with NIH? When you're doing drug testing, you don't give everybody's individual name. And it's personal. They do drug testing on individuals. What does that mean for how the entire federal government looks at science? And EPA was not smart enough to figure out how to distinguish EPA stuff from everybody else's. So if the administration signs off on this, that this is the only science you're going to accept, what the hell do you do with everything else? So I'm interested in asking that question when it gets finalized, which it will. But I thought they had dropped it because it was so ridiculous. But apparently that's not the case.
Yes.
You had touched on this, but the Trump administration's attack on science and the methodology, particularly that they're trying to change the modeling so that we're no longer looking at climate 100 years out, but we're looking at
Yes,
it until
right.
2040. So one of the things I'm worried about is that for us, our strongest argument is that it's not politics, it's science. But when the science model has changed and we can no longer use those graphs in our reports, what ground do we have to stand on?
You're right. I mean, basically, the administration is trying very hard to look at what is the most useful information and not make it available to the public and to you to be able to explain it to the public. The only thing I can tell you is that the United States of America is not the only place that does good climate science. So you will have access to information that provides you an ability to tell a story from really valid science across the world. And it has to be a short-lived and kind of failed strategy to think that they can hide this information from the American public.
I'm having flashbacks back here, like I need to like star one really quick so I can make sure I'm in your queue. I have a classic Washington two-parter here, if you don't mind. One, like looking back to the Obama administration and the pace that it took with addressing climate change, first attempting with Waxman-Markey and failing, and then moving forward with the Clean Power Plan, what would your advice be to, if there is a Democratic administration next, on how quickly to move and what to approach first? And secondly, and relatedly, do you think that Democrats should be like moving forward faster and harder to subpoena executives from oil companies and have them testifying in Congress about how long they've known about this problem and what they've done that has hidden it?
Well, let me answer both of those. Let me answer the last one first. You know, one of the things that I think is making the fossil fuel companies most nervous are the liability lawsuits that are happening. I think they matter. I think the idea of getting fossil fuel companies to tell the truth about what they knew and when they knew it is a significant step forward. And I think you're seeing that. I think they're getting really nervous. What I would do if I were sort of starting over again is I think you're right that a lot of the work that EPA did is being dismantled, or at least attempted to be dismantled. The last thing I would do is simply redo it. The world's changed and the science has changed even since then. So you got to step back and think about this a little bit. And I think there's a lot of groups organized and thinking about this right now, about what you do. But I'll give you a clear example is the Clean Power Plan's already been blown away by the change in clean energy already. I don't consider that to be a failure. I think it's great. Because the way in which I believe you write regulations is to get a ball moving, not to make it so extreme that you have to go to the end, you know, to tell what the end result has to be. And I'm really happy with the way clean energy is moving. So you have to think about what's the next thing that needs to be done and how do you keep things moving forward. So it's not about redoing, but it is about reinventing on the basis of what we know now.
Is the next thing legislation or regulation? Like, is it necessary at this point to pursue legislation instead?
That's a really good question. Part of it will depend on the examples we see from the states, and let me explain why. You know, I think what's happening at the state and local level is enormously important to test new strategies. I think part of the drama about the federal government and what we do or don't do should actually be about how the federal government spends money, as opposed to how the federal government regulates. So let me step back a little bit. Regulation is going to be important. Redoing regulations will be fine. Rethinking those to push the envelope. Thinking about congressional action. I am not a big fan of a big carbon price, because I think that's a big answer that no one will understand, and it'll go into the ether, and you'll be wondering whether you ever got the price right and whether it'll ever make a difference. And there are carbon markets now that will make no difference. So it's not the ultimate answer. But when I'm talking about money spent, this is what I mean, is that you have a farm bill that's spent. And if you're worried about agriculture, which I do a lot because food and water are the essentials of human life. That is essentially what's at risk in climate, is food and water. And if you look at food, you have an agriculture system that in the United States has been all shifting towards big industrial agriculture, which is horrible for natural resources, horrible for nutrition, horrible for workers, horrible because it emits lots of methane emissions. And the Farm Bill rewards that in spades. That's what it does. It doesn't spend enough resources that are directed towards what we consider to be family farms. Trying to figure out how you grow food and use regenerative farming technologies that get out of fossil fuel-based, organic pesticides and fertilizers. So, and if you look, just go over and over again, every penny that the federal government spends, and you will see that it's all leaning towards more of what we've already done. You look at how we do the FEMA response is all, let's rebuild exactly the way we did it before, even if you've done it for the 12th time, when if you just rezoned and moved people out, you wouldn't have to do it, but they're not looking at that. They're just rebuilding and rebuilding. If you look at dollars that we use at EPA on state revolving fund money, SRF dollars that build water and wastewater systems, you got to challenge them to look at what wastewater and water systems need to look at to serve the next 100 years, not the last. But we're really not looking at that. We're just giving it to them and they dole it out. If you look at what's happening with housing, the federal government sends huge signals on housing, is what they're going to back with federally insured mortgages. And they're not looking at efficient housing requirements. They're not looking at low-income housing, where you probably ought to have air conditioning when you know you're going to have heat stress galore. That's a technical term. Moving forward, this is what drives me nuts, is that we think the system's going to change while keeping the system exactly the way it currently exists. So if I were one of the people designing a climate plan as a presidential candidate, I wouldn't tally the amount of money it would cost to fix climate change. I'd look at how we're spending federal dollars. The military is the best example of a place that has already created probably half or 3/4 of the solutions you need for climate change. It's just we don't do it. We don't use it. We don't invest in it. And it just drives me to drink. Where is my drink?
Yes.
Yeah, so I don't know if you've gotten a chance to look at all of the candidates' climate change policies or any, it gets pretty granular.
Yeah.
But are they talking about the issue correctly? A lot of the candidates will start by saying that they want to re-enter the Paris Climate Agreement, and they get a lot of, cheers with that. But what else needs to happen within policy proposals?
Yeah.
Where do we start?
Well, the exciting thing is they're actually talking about this, and they do have climate plans. I think we've got to celebrate that. I literally remember the excitement of sitting around the TV watching a presidential debate. And if you got one mention of climate change, it was like, oh my God, this is great. So you like have a climate debate, it's pretty shocking.
Yeah.
So I really don't want to be very critical. I think it's terrific that they have climate plans. I think it's hysterical that the minute Inslee left, everybody thought he was terrific and stole his plans. I mean, I'm sure he thinks it's hysterical too, right? Oh, maybe not. But I mean, so a lot of them did borrow and recognize that they were borrowing from his plans because he's been, thinking about this stuff for like decades. He's just a lovely person and has done a great job. Mm-hmm. And so I've seen a lot of the plans. I find them hard to criticize because they all emphasize different things depending upon where they are. And I really do think that the main thing is that they feel like they have to do this and be part of it. And I think that's the big success story, not what the details of the plans are.
Yes.
I'd love to hear your wisdom on prioritization, which is something that me and the environment team at the LA Times talk about a lot. So climate change obviously is the issue that we feel a personal call to, a moral call to. It's where kind of all of the environmental attention is going right now. But especially if each of us are only able to take on one or two investigative projects a year, do we shift so much to climate change and adaptation, all these conversations, and at the expense of uncovering lead contamination in Flint, or the accountability of Superfund cleanups of legacy toxics that are still not cleaned up 30 years since they stopped polluting a body of water or a really important piece of land that is affecting the health of the community. So I think, we're not able to cover everything. We are struggling with that balance.
Yeah.
And each of us are making these conscious decisions every day of what really important issue we're not doing. And obviously there are some sweet spots between pollution and climate change. It'd be great if we can cover both in one project. But I think I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we really move forward on climate change in a meaningful way without forgetting kind of the other really important issues that are traditional to, environmental reporting and environmental accountability.
I don't know how to answer that. Maybe after you sit here for a couple of days, you can give me the answer. Honestly, it's just very hard. There are so many sort of pollution-related issues that are going on. I think the challenge that I face right now in Washington is what's happening there is not normal. Every bit of the fabric of protections are being unraveled. So I'm not trying to discourage you from covering, the hazardous waste landfill that's leaking. You have to. That is an issue that directly impacts human lives. I think the challenge that we face with climate is that it directly impacts every human life. So I think any ability to raise these issues and make them personal is important. And I just can't make those decisions for you. I think part of the problem we have with climate change is it impacts so many factors of our lives that it gets really boring. It's like the little kid crying wolf when there is a wolf all the time. What the hell do you do? Kid needs to shut up or the wolf's got to die, one or the other. And so, seriously, it just gets like, whoa. So I don't know. I think maybe the whole reason to get together is to ask those questions, is how do you stick together as a group? How do you make what you say relevant? How do you not say it so many times that people get numb to it? And I think that's the challenge we face with climate, which is why I tend to think that the solutions-oriented stuff is a really good approach. It's how do you fix it? How do you engage people? How do you convince them that they should want these things even if climate change wasn't happening? That's the thing we need to get them, is to demand it, not to want it. Demand it. And that's the challenge I think we face.
One more question? Okay.
Do you have any tips on how to talk to your family about climate change at the Thanksgiving table?
Remove the silverware and the knives. Let everybody know that there's more than one turkey at the table. I don't know. You know, that's one of the most distressing things for me is you know, people come up to me a lot and they say, I don't believe in climate change. I'm like, okay, I don't believe in UFOs. There you go. We're kind of done with that conversation. It's not a belief system. You know, it really, that's not just it. And so I really don't know, but it has to get into the ether of everyday conversation. That's all I know. It can't be the style like, oh, they brought up climate change. How could they do that? And so maybe it's a longer conversation than you can have at one table at one time. So maybe it's listening to people at that table and talking it through and explaining why one person doesn't believe it and another person has concerns about it. And maybe it's recognizing that they're not a bad person, you just don't think they're informed well. And maybe it's more than one conversation, and maybe it's sending them some stuff to read, and maybe they'll read it, and maybe next year it won't be so bad. I don't know what else to do. What I know it will never work is if when you bring it up, you leave the table or you fail to talk or listen to one another or go back to your dessert. That's all I think.
Well, it's been wonderful to have this conversation with you, Gina. You're amazing, and I'm sure we're going to hear much about the work that you do and the impact that you're going to have now with NRDC leading this agency. So thank you for
Vanessa, thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you all.